In the financial world, when a major institution starts showing signs of systemic instability, it's rarely about the numbers on the balance sheet. It signals something deeper. That's where we are right now with what's happening at First Republic Trust in the broader banking sector. But this isn't just a story about one bank. From an investor's perspective, this is less about quarterly earnings and more about the structural integrity of American institutions. You see, what we're witnessing matters to every single American, whether you check your bank account daily or simply trust the system to work. Structural collapse doesn't always announce itself with sirens and panic. Sometimes it begins with quiet regulatory failures, with silent erosions of oversight we ignore until it's too late. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. In my 94 years, I've seen 14 recessions, 3 major banking crises, and countless moments when confidence in American institutions wavered. As someone who has observed capital markets for over half a century, I can tell you this: banks don't fail in isolation. They fail when the regulatory framework designed to protect them becomes compromised by political interference. You see, the separation between political power and financial oversight isn't just good policy. It's the firewall that keeps your savings secure. And right now, that firewall is developing cracks. Markets teach you to watch for patterns, not headlines. In business, we have a saying: when the guard stops guarding, the vault becomes vulnerable. Capital doesn't lie, and neither do the signals coming from Washington. Now, I'm not here to alarm you. Let me be clear about something. From where I sit, having watched the system adapt and survive for nearly a century, I believe in its resilience. But resilience requires maintenance. It requires leaders who understand that short-term political gains cannot justify long-term institutional damage. And what's happening right now is testing that understanding in ways we haven't seen since the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. What happened over the past 3 weeks is particularly telling. You see, the conversation inside federal banking agencies has shifted from routine oversight to crisis management. According to sources who spoke with Bloomberg on October 28th, senior officials at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency have raised concerns about political pressure affecting their independence. From a risk management view, the concern lies in convergence: regulatory capture from one direction, executive pressure from another, and mounting evidence that enforcement decisions are being influenced by factors that have nothing to do with banking stability. In corporate terms, it's like a board of directors being overruled by a majority shareholder who doesn't understand the business. You see, you don't see that pattern unless the system's immune response is being suppressed. Here's where it gets interesting. New documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests reveal that between August and October 2025, at least 7 career banking examiners submitted internal complaints alleging that their safety and soundness assessments were being overridden by political appointees. These aren't junior analysts. We're talking about professionals with an average of 22 years of experience in banking supervision. Legal expert Sarah Bloom Raskin, former Deputy Treasury Secretary and Federal Reserve Board member, stated in testimony before the Senate Banking Committee on October 30th, "When political considerations infiltrate the examination process, the entire premise of independent banking regulation collapses. You're not protecting depositors anymore. You're protecting political relationships." That's not partisan commentary. That's structural analysis from someone who spent decades inside the machinery. You see, when insiders with that level of credibility start sounding alarms, the issue has moved from speculation to documented institutional breakdown. Now, here's the kicker. The concerns aren't just about one bank or one decision. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal on November 2nd, First Republic Trust received 3 separate regulatory warnings between June and September about capital adequacy ratios falling below statutory minimums. Standard procedure requires escalating enforcement actions when warnings go unaddressed. Yet, according to 4 former OCC officials who spoke with the Journal, those enforcement actions were delayed pending further review at senior levels. That phrase, further review at senior levels, is regulatory code. You see, it means someone above the examiners stopped the normal process. In any system, political or financial, when enforcement mechanisms are delayed for reasons unrelated to the violation itself, you create moral hazard. That's the technical term. The practical term is you tell every other institution that the rules are negotiable if you have the right connections. And once that message spreads, prudent risk management gets replaced by political calculation. The cost isn't immediate, it compounds, just like interest. Let's be real for a second. This pattern isn't new to American history. We saw it in the savings and loan crisis when regulatory forbearance, the practice of not enforcing rules against troubled institutions, turned hundreds of billions in losses into a taxpayer bailout. We saw it again in 2008 when the relationship between Wall Street firms and their regulators became so cozy that warning signs were dismissed as crying wolf. You see, each time we forget this lesson, we pay for it, not in stock prices, in systemic trust. What's unfolding now carries echoes of both those crises, but with a critical difference. This time, the political interference isn't subtle backroom dealing. According to testimony from Dr. Martin Gruenberg, former chairman of the FDIC, during the October 30th Senate hearing, we are seeing a pattern of direct communication from White House staff to agency leadership requesting specific outcomes in pending enforcement matters. This represents an unprecedented breach of the administrative separation that has protected banking supervision since the Dodd-Frank reforms. That's significant. You see, Dodd-Frank was passed specifically to create walls between political influence and banking oversight after 2008, proved how dangerous that mixing could be. When a former FDIC chairman states under oath that those walls are being breached, it's not speculation. It's evidence of institutional breakdown. And here's what makes it even more concerning. 3 separate congressional offices confirmed to Politico on November 1st that they've received whistleblower complaints from within the Treasury Department alleging that banking enforcement decisions are being coordinated with political strategy meetings. Think about what that means. You see, the decision about whether a bank is safe enough to hold your deposits is supposedly being made in coordination with political operatives whose job is winning elections, not protecting the financial system. That's not governance. That's roulette with your life savings. Now, legal scholars have flagged 2 specific incidents that crystallize these concerns. The first occurred on September 15th when First Republic Trust was scheduled to face a mandatory public enforcement action due to repeated capital violations. Standard procedure, as outlined in Section 8 of the Federal Deposit Insurance Act, requires public disclosure when a bank enters into a consent order. Yet, according to documents reviewed by ProPublica and published on October 25th, senior OCC leadership issued an internal memo postponing the action pending resolution of related policy considerations. That language is deliberately vague, you see, but former regulators who spoke with ProPublica interpreted it as political interference. One stated, "There are no policy considerations that override statutory capital requirements. Either the bank meets the minimums or it doesn't. Math doesn't negotiate." The concern isn't just about who was targeted or protected. It's about the process. When regulatory action gets delayed for reasons that have nothing to do with banking safety, precedent gets set. And in both markets and governance, bad precedent becomes a cost nobody calculates until the bill arrives. But what followed was even more troubling. Reports surfaced in late October that a senior bank examiner, Thomas Honig, a 30-year veteran of the OCC, was reassigned from the First Republic Trust examination team after refusing to sign off on an internal assessment that downplayed the bank's capital deficiencies. According to sources who spoke with American Banker on October 29th, Honig submitted a formal dissent arguing that the bank's Tier 1 capital ratio had fallen to 6.2%, well below the regulatory minimum of 8%, and that continued forbearance posed systemic risk. In any system, political or financial, when professionals are reassigned for refusing to ignore violations, we stop measuring safety and start measuring loyalty. You see, this isn't about one person's career. It's about whether the entire examination process has integrity. If examiners know that honest assessments lead to reassignment while compliant assessments lead to promotion, the incentive structure collapses. And once accountability is compromised in a regulatory system, rebuilding trust takes decades, not election cycles. According to multiple sources, Honig has reportedly retained legal counsel and is cooperating with congressional investigators. The message is becoming clear. comply with political pressure, or face professional consequences. That tactic may sound like effective management, but it resembles coercion more than leadership. You see, when an agency starts targeting its own career staff for maintaining professional standards, it reflects not strength but institutional corruption. In any boardroom, forcing out voices of technical integrity would trigger shareholder lawsuits and board revolts. In banking regulation, the stakes are higher because the shareholders are every American with a bank account. An emergency meeting of the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council was convened on October 20th after news broke that examination standards were being inconsistently applied across institutions. According to the meeting minutes obtained by Reuters, representatives from all 5 federal banking agencies expressed concern about external pressures affecting examination independence. But what's more telling is what happened behind the scenes. As congressional committees began requesting documents, senior officials at the OCC reportedly began discussing how to preserve institutional credibility while managing political expectations. You see, that indicates something deeper than bureaucratic friction. It suggests a recognition within the agencies themselves that they're losing the ability to perform their core function, ensuring the safety and soundness of the banking system independent of political consideration. Let me clarify what banking independence really means, because it's important. You see, the regulatory system was designed to operate on technical merit, not political convenience. After the banking panics of the 1930s and the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, Congress created a framework where career professionals, not political appointees, would make the actual enforcement decisions. This wasn't about removing democratic accountability. It was about creating a buffer between short-term political pressures and long-term financial stability. You see, politicians operate on election cycles. Banks operate on capital cycles. When those two timelines collide without professional mediation, you get exactly what we got in 2008. Institutions deemed too big to fail being protected until they became too big to save. Multiple former regulators, including Sheila Bair, former FDIC chair, and William Dudley, former president of the New York Federal Reserve, have publicly warned that the current dynamic is eroding that independence. Bair stated in an interview with CNBC on October 31st, "When I ran the FDIC, there were plenty of times the White House wanted us to go easy on certain institutions. We said no, that's our job. If current regulators can't say no, the system is broken." That's not hyperbole. That's lived experience from someone who navigated the 2008 crisis. The push to maintain regulatory integrity hasn't emerged overnight. You see, it's been years in the making. Banking policy experts, former regulators, and even some members of Congress have steadily compiled evidence that the examination process is being compromised. But timing in matters of financial stability, like an investment, is everything. Regulators have exercised restraint not out of timidity but out of strategic caution. You see, a poorly timed public dispute with political leadership doesn't just create headlines. It can trigger the very crisis you're trying to prevent. That's the tightrope they're walking. History casts a long shadow here. Every major banking crisis in American history has involved some combination of regulatory capture and political interference. The Panic of 1907, the Great Depression, savings and loan, 2008. You see, each time we swore we'd learn the lesson. Each time we created new rules, new agencies, new safeguards, and each time within a generation, political pressure found a way to erode those protections. The pattern is consistent. Short-term political interests override long-term institutional stability. Risks accumulate in silence. And by the time the public realizes what's happening, the damage is done. That's why experienced regulators have been waiting for a trigger so clear, so institutionally dangerous, that even those benefiting from the current arrangement would be forced to reconsider. The First Republic Trust situation may represent that moment. For some, the delays in enforcement feel like reasonable flexibility. But for others, they signal a fundamental departure from the post-2008 framework that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of regulatory forbearance. This isn't just about perception. It's about whether banking supervision is drifting too far from the system of independent judgment designed to protect depositors and prevent systemic risk. In a properly functioning regulatory system, examination results drive enforcement actions. The relationship is mechanical, predictable, and immune to outside influence. You see, when a bank's capital falls below minimums, enforcement begins automatically. It's not designed for discretionary delay. That automation exists for a reason. It removes human judgment, and with it, the opportunity for corruption. But when senior leadership can halt that process with phrases like pending further review, the automation breaks. Discretion returns. And with discretion comes the possibility that factors other than safety and soundness will drive decisions. Leadership becomes unpredictable. You see, in both markets and government, unpredictability erodes trust faster than any single policy failure. These regulatory protocols are not red tape. They exist to prevent the kind of catastrophic failures that cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. Declaring a bank undercapitalized doesn't just create a headline. It activates a cascade of mandatory actions, capital restoration plans, dividend restrictions, growth limitations, and if conditions worsen, receivership. These are tools meant for depositor protection, not political management. When those tools are delayed or deployed selectively based on political considerations, you see, former regulators aren't just concerned, they're alarmed, because if the system allows it once, precedent makes it easier the next time, and the time after that, until the exception becomes the rule. Now we shift to the broader pattern, and this is where things get even more troubling. According to data compiled by the Government Accountability Office and released in a preliminary report on October 27th, enforcement actions across all federally regulated banks declined by 34% between January and September 2025 compared to the same period in 2024, despite capital ratios across the industry declining by an average of 1-2 percentage points. That's statistically significant. You see, when risk indicators go up but enforcement goes down, the gap between reality and response grows. That gap is where crises incubate. Financial historian Charles Calamiris of Columbia University, in testimony before the House Financial Services Committee on November 3rd, noted, "We are observing a classic pattern of regulatory forbearance masquerading as prudent flexibility. The 2008 crisis taught us that forbearance doesn't buy time to recover. It buys time for losses to compound." This isn't just a story about compliance officers and spreadsheets. According to independent analysts at the Financial Stability Oversight Council's October meeting, forbearance at one institution creates competitive pressure across the industry. If Bank A doesn't have to maintain capital minimums because of political connections, Bank B faces a choice: compete by taking more risk or lose market share by staying prudent. You see, that's not a hypothetical. That's exactly the dynamic that fueled the savings and loan crisis. Once the rules become negotiable for some, they become irrelevant for all. In parallel with these concerns, another development made headlines. A federal judge in Washington, D.C. issued a temporary restraining order on October 26th, blocking the OCC from closing an unrelated investigation into compliance failures at another regional bank, citing evidence that political considerations appear to have infected the decision-making process. The court's language was unusually direct. Judge Patricia Millett wrote, "Independent regulatory agencies exist precisely to insulate technical decisions from political winds. When that insulation fails, public confidence in the entire financial system becomes collateral damage." That's not activist judicial overreach. That's a federal judge recognizing that the institutional foundations of banking regulation are under stress. In investment terms, this isn't just a single sector issue, it's governance risk. When decisions that should be technical become political, value erodes everywhere. Capital becomes less efficient, risk becomes harder to price, and ultimately, the entire economy pays the cost through slower growth and periodic crises. Congressional oversight committees have raised an important concern that selective regulatory forbearance is being used to pressure Congress on unrelated legislative priorities. According to reporting by the New York Times on October 28th, 3 separate members of the Senate Banking Committee confirmed they've been told by Treasury officials that resolution of certain enforcement matters is tied to progress on administration priorities, including infrastructure spending and tax reform. If true, and I stress if, that represents a dangerous conflation of banking safety with legislative horse trading. One senator, who requested anonymity to speak candidly, stated, We're being told the financial system's stability depends on passing the president's agenda. That's not how this is supposed to work. Bank capital ratios don't care about infrastructure bills. Free Speech for Banking, a nonpartisan watchdog organization, has been tracking regulatory independence since 2020. Their current assessment, published on October 30th, lists 19 separate incidents since January suggesting political interference in banking oversight. Some items on that list are documented through FOIA requests. Others remain allegations. But what's changed is the volume and the consistency of the pattern. You see, 3 isolated complaints over a year might reflect personality conflicts or bureaucratic friction. 19 incidents across 9 months, corroborated by multiple independent sources, suggests systemic pressure. And that's what separates noise from signal. What sets this situation apart from previous concerns isn't just the content, it's the convergence. It's no longer just progressive policy advocates raising questions about regulatory capture. You see, conservative banking experts, former Treasury officials from both parties, and career civil servants are expressing alarm. Their concern isn't partisan, it's structural. When bipartisan expertise converges on the idea that institutional boundaries are being violated, the conversation shifts from politics to governance. The legal framework for banking independence was strengthened significantly after 2008. The Dodd-Frank Act included specific provisions designed to insulate examination decisions from political pressure. Section 112 requires that enforcement actions be based solely on safety and soundness considerations, with a clear paper trail documenting the technical basis for decisions. According to legal analysis by the Brookings Institution published on October 29th, at least 5 enforcement delays at First Republic Trust lack the required documentation, potentially violating Section 112's transparency requirements. That's not a small gap. You see, documentation requirements exist precisely to prevent the kind of informal pressure that's difficult to prove but easy to exert. When the paper trail disappears, so does accountability. The immediate consequence is that depositors at First Republic Trust may be holding accounts at an institution whose true financial condition has been obscured by regulatory delays. But the broader consequence is that every American with money in any bank now has reason to question whether their institution's safety ratings reflect reality or political convenience. The coming days will clarify whether regulatory agencies can reassert their independence or whether political pressure has fundamentally compromised their function. According to sources familiar with ongoing internal deliberations, career staff at both the OCC and FDIC are preparing formal recommendations for a joint enforcement action at First Republic Trust, regardless of political pushback. That represents either the last stand of institutional integrity or the beginning of a professional purge. We'll know which based on what happens next. Watch for several indicators. First, personnel moves. If senior examiners start leaving or getting reassigned en masse, that signals surrender to political pressure. Second, enforcement actions. If First Republic Trust faces real consequences despite political connections, that signals the system still has immunity. Third, congressional response. If oversight committees treat this as routine rather than urgent, that signals acceptance of a new normal where banking regulation is just another political tool. From where I sit, having watched this system survive and adapt for 94 years, I believe we're at an inflection point. The banking system's stability depends not on capital ratios alone, but on the credibility of the regulatory framework that monitors those ratios. When that credibility erodes, capital flight becomes rational, bank runs become logical, and the very institutions designed to prevent financial panic become incapable of doing so. That's not speculation, that's applied history. What we're watching is not about one bank or one administration. It's a stress test of whether the post-2008 reforms can withstand political pressure or whether we've already reverted to the pre-crisis model where connections matter more than capital. You see, the American banking system has survived and thrived for over a century because despite periodic failures, we've maintained the principle that technical expertise, not political power, determines which institutions are safe and which are not. Once that principle dies, the system it protects begins dying with it. Every investor, every business owner, every family with a mortgage or a savings account should understand that their financial security depends on regulatory independence. Not because regulators are perfect, but because politicized regulation is worse. History proves it. 2008 proved it. And if we're not careful, 2026 might prove it again. The stakes are not abstract. They're your retirement account, your business line of credit, your children's college fund. All of it depends on a banking system that operates on rules, not relationships. Listen, I've lived through the Great Depression's tail end, the stagflation of the 1970s, the savings and loan collapse, and the 2008 financial crisis. I've seen markets crash and recover, banks fail and get replaced, and through it all, the system adapted because it maintained credibility. But credibility is like Humpty Dumpty. Once broken, all the king's horses and all the king's men struggle to put it back together. This moment will define whether we learned anything from 2008 or whether we're doomed to repeat it with a new cast of characters but the same corrupted script. What happens in the next few weeks at First Republic Trust matters less than what it reveals about whether American banking regulation can still function as intended. If career professionals can assert technical judgment without fear of retaliation, we might avoid crisis. If political pressure continues to override professional judgment, we're not avoiding anything. We're just postponing it. And in finance, postponement isn't free. It compounds. You see, we're not spectators in this story. We're all stakeholders. Whether we're managing retirement portfolios, running small businesses, or simply trying to build a secure future, the integrity of banking regulation determines the environment in which we all operate. It's why this matters. That's why I'm speaking up. The immediate path forward hinges on whether career regulators find the courage to enforce the rules they're sworn to uphold, regardless of political pressure. While political appointees may have titles, career examiners have something more valuable: technical expertise and institutional memory. The true test is whether that expertise can still overcome political convenience. This is not merely a regulatory crisis. It's a test of whether democratic capitalism's supporting institutions can maintain independence when it's inconvenient for those in power. The question is whether the antibodies of our financial system, oversight, accountability, and professional standards, remain strong enough to fight infection from political pathogens. Parallel concerns about regulatory independence and political interference reveal a system exploring every available mechanism to maintain credibility while under pressure. This response indicates both the severity of the threat and the resilience of institutional norms. But resilience without enforcement is just hope. And hope is not a strategy. Watch not only for press releases and congressional hearings, but for personnel actions, enforcement decisions, and regulatory guidance documents. These are the leading indicators of whether independence survives or surrenders. The weight of this moment rests on the shoulders of career civil servants whose names you'll never know, but whose decisions will affect your financial security for years to come. Their choices, made under political pressure and professional obligation, will become precedent for how future crises are handled. The cost of enforcement is political backlash. The cost of forbearance is systemic risk. And the cost of getting that calculation wrong is measured in trillions of dollars and decades of recovery. This is not about one administration or one party. It's about whether we as a nation still believe in the institutional separations that protect our prosperity, or whether we've decided they're optional when politically inconvenient. In investing, I've always said the most important quality is discipline, not intelligence. The same is true for regulation. Do we have the discipline to enforce standards when it's difficult, when it's unpopular, when it costs us politically? That's the test. And we're all being graded. I've lived through enough crises to know this. The system can bend quite far before it breaks, but it can't bend forever. And right now, we're testing the limits. What we do now, what our regulators do now, will define not just this banking cycle, but the integrity of American finance for decades to come. The institutions we inherit aren't ours to break for short-term political gain. They're ours to protect and pass on. And if we fail that duty, the cost won't be political. It'll be financial. It'll be generational. So pay attention, stay informed, and remember, in any system, silence in the face of institutional decay is a choice, and sometimes the most expensive choice of all.